Shalom and welcome to Biblical Faith with Sam Peak. We invite you to join us as Sam brings a study in the Torah from the Jewish sages. And now our speaker, Sam Peak.
So, Shalom Aleichem. Let's just jump immediately. We're in Rabbi Basar's book on Pirkei Avot, the chapters of the fathers. If you have the book, we're on page 194 using the actually the commentary of the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judalo of Prague. We're looking at chapter 3 of Pirkei Avot and Mishnah number 19, which is a saying, a teaching that is given to us, and we've already seen there's unbelievable things that are packed into this little teaching from Rabbi Akiva, where he says everything is seen, yet the freedom of choice is given. The world is judged just with goodness, and that everything depends, and they translate here on the majority of good deeds, but actually I'm looking at the Hebrew, and it really says everything depends upon the majority of deeds, the majority of actions, okay? So on page 190, excuse me, turn the page, Sam, okay. On page 194, the Maharal begins telling us that God does not assess a person deed by deed. Now we have to qualify that, and he will in a little bit, okay? He doesn't assess an entire person deed by deed. He assesses the entire person, in other words, the person himself, okay? One is considered a righteous person if you do mainly righteousness. Alternatively, he says the majority of his actions could also establish guilt. If you wouldn't be considered a righteous person, you're a guilty person if that's what you mostly do. As a result of that, though, every sin carries an enormous risk. As the rabbis said, now he is about to quote a conversation here from the Talmud, from Kiddushin 40b. We need to come back. We're going to go through the Maharal's teaching on this, probably to the end of what he has to say. Then I would actually like to come back to this very conversation, this teaching from Kiddushin 40, and look at it from a different, another level of understanding, okay? So every sin carries an enormous risk, as the rabbis have said, and here's the quote: a person should consider himself as being half guilty and half worthy. If he does a single extra mitzvah, happy is he, for he swings the balance to an assessment of worthy. Okay? But if he does a single extra sin, woe to him, for then he swings the balance to an assessment of guilty. All right? Now, we're going to look at this in a different way, but right now, let's look at it on the simple level of what the Maharal is trying to point out to us, okay? He's trying to point out to us just how important a mitzvah is, because you never know, you might swing your entire balance the other way, and he's just how risky a sin is, because you might swing it the wrong way. He begins, he says, this doesn't mean that God overlooks the sins of a person who on the balance is righteous. In other words, the majority of their deeds, most of their actions, thoughts, speech, and actions are righteous. That doesn't mean that they can sin and that God just overlooks that, okay? He says it also doesn't mean that one who on balance is guilty, that they don't get credit if they do a mitzvah, okay? That is not the case, he says, because a person is rewarded for each mitzvah, even if he did only one good deed in his entire life. He gets a reward for it. Likewise, one is punished for every sin, or in other words, every sin has consequences that we will perceive as punishment. Again, I like this other perspective, that Hashem is making happen in order to try to bring you to himself. So everyone is punished for each sin, even if he did only one transgression amid an entire lifetime of goodness. All right? Do we understand? The point that the Maharal is getting from this is absolutely every action that we do, every thought that we have, every word that we say, everything that we do, action that we do, or sometimes inaction if we should be doing something and we're not. Every one of those is so important, and every one of them is judged. Every one of them is either rewarded or it brings with it a consequence that's not pleasing. So he says, so what is it then that depends on the majority of deeds? He says the majority of deeds determines whether one is assessed as righteous or whether one is assessed as evil. And one who is deemed righteous, they're deemed worthy of the world to come, and an evil person deserves to lose the world to come. He's deemed guilty and not worthy of the world to come. Nevertheless, he says, a righteous person will be punished for his sins, and the evil person will still be rewarded for his good deeds. Now he's going to give a metaphor, okay? He brings a parable, the Maharal does. He said, and that is a king, his friend, and someone else who he really dislikes, okay? So we have a king, and we have a friend that he really likes, and then he has someone also there that he doesn't really care for too much. The friend is always welcome, and even if he offends the king, then the king assesses a penalty, and the person continues to be his friend. By contrast, the person that the king dislikes actually might do the king a favor, which the king will reciprocate, he says, while still remaining at odds with him. He still doesn't like him, but he'll still reciprocate. He'll reward him some way for doing the favor for him. He says, so it is the same way with the righteous and the guilty. The righteous person, based on the majority of his deeds, because he's mainly a righteous person, is treated in a manner that is appropriate to a righteous person, but is penalized. If he sins, he's penalized for whatever sins that there is, but the relationship still remains, in other words. But God treats an evil person, he says, as befits somebody who hates him. So not only does the king dislike that person, but that person also dislikes the king, hates him, in fact. So God treats an evil person as befits one who hates him. But he will compensate him for the few mitzvot, the few good deeds, the few favors which he did. All right? And even that, now don't get the idea. So we can read that and say, oh, well, God hates all those people who... No, absolutely not. And even both his compensation to them for any good thing that they do, or his punishment of them also, is all designed. Remember what Rabbi Akiva said so clearly. The world is judged by his goodness. It's all meant for goodness. It's all meant to bring us close to him. All right? Now he talks about, he says, the primary world. And this is something that many of the Hasidic Rebbes were always talking about, and is something that we probably also need to get in our heads. However, okay, the reason I don't harp on it too much is because people can get the idea that this world, Olam Hazeh, is not important. We need to realize that Olam Hazeh is actually the most important world, because Olam Hazeh, this world that we're in right now, this is the world in which everything is built or it's destroyed. This is the world in which it literally, our thoughts, speech, and action are used to create our world to come, okay?
Amen.
However, the primary world is not this world. The primary world really is the world to come, okay? And this world is secondary to it. But this world is still the most important thing right now. It's the most important thing, okay? So don't get that idea. You know, some people, what's the saying they have? They're so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good, you know, which is a way of saying that actually they just don't do anything.
Right.
So why do anything? Because, you know, I don't know. Anyway. He says the primary world is the world to come. This world is secondary, and it's proper, he said, for the primary nature of a person to be accommodated in the primary world. And the secondary nature is properly dealt with in the secondary world. You see what he's saying? A soul's primary nature is being a soul, is spiritual. That's for the world to come. Our secondary nature is because we're placed in a body. We also have an animal soul. That's in this world. We know the key is, actually, it's not that I'm not agreeing with him. I'm just putting the emphasis somewhere else. We actually, in this world, we have to overcome that secondary nature. We have to rule it and not let it rule us. But what he says is, a person who is primarily righteous, his reasoning is that this is why the sages say you don't really receive rewards for mitzvot in this world, okay? You get interest. The real reward is in the world to come. And he says a person who is primarily righteous will receive his reward in the world to come. And then his few sins, that's his secondary nature, they are dealt with in this world. A person who is primarily evil, if they're upside down, now I see what he's saying. If they're upside down and what appears to be their primary nature is the animal soul, okay, they will receive punishment in the next world, okay? And in his few good deeds which are secondary, they're actually rewarded in this world. And this is the idea. The wicked, whatever good they do, they receive their full payment here. Okay. All right. He says, this thought is expressed by the rabbis as follows. And he's quoting now again from, this is a follow-up actually in Kiddushin 40b. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Tzadok, said, to what are the righteous in this world compared? How can we compare them to something? To a tree that stands entirely in a pure place, except for one branch that overhangs an impure place. If that particular branch is cut off, then all of it is in a pure place. Now listen to what they're saying. So does God bring afflictions upon the righteous in this world in order to cut off that branch, in order that they will inherit the world to come. But it's in order to cut off that branch, to separate from that branch. To what are the evil people, he says, in this world compared? They're compared to a tree that stands entirely in an impure place, except for a branch that overhangs a pure place. If that branch is cut off, then the whole tree is in an impure place. And so does God bring about good for them in this world, he says, in order to drive them to inherit the lowest level of Gehinnom. This is an explanation of why the good prosper, or the evil prosper, and the righteous suffer. And unbelievably so. Now, he goes on and he says, as we explained, the rabbis compare the primary nature of a person to a tree, and the secondary nature of a person to a mere branch. So the primary nature is the whole tree, secondary nature is a branch. One's primary achievements, he says, are actually in the world to come, which is the place of one's primary existence. Secondary behavior is dealt with in this world, for it is secondary to the world to come. So to an evil person, to do a good deed, that's secondary to them. It's not normal. For a righteous person, to commit a sin, that's also secondary to them. It's not normal. Okay? Both of those not normal things are dealt with in this world. And the primary thing you are, what you actually are, that's dealt with in the world to come. He says it's also possible to explain this phrase, this particular phrase of the Mishnah, as meaning everything depends upon the abundance of deeds. Well, of course, that's exactly the way it should be translated. I'm not sure why they translated it differently. But anyway, do not think, he says, that God has a standard reward for those who are deemed to be righteous, and that not every mitzvah is rewarded. Nor should you think that he has a standard punishment for those deemed to be guilty, and that not every sin is penalized. Rather, everything depends on the abundance, how much, the majority of deeds. In other words, every mitzvah is rewarded and every sin is punished. Okay. Now, stop right there before we go on to Mishnah number 20. All right? Because we have to back up, and I know we absolutely do not have time in this particular lesson, this particular show. But, make sure I don't cut myself off here. You know, quite a few years ago, Jason built this, I think Jason and Pat built this notebook for me of Rabbi Yehuda Lev Ashlag's introduction to the Zohar and introduction to the study of the 10 Sefirot. And I've added a lot of stuff to it, and it's something I schlep with me everywhere I go. I mean, I need to get a little bigger. I'm beginning to break it. But Rabbi Yehuda Lev Ashlag, the Baal HaSulam. Now, with God's help, I hope I marked my place. If I didn't mark my place, we're not going to do this at all. But I think I did. Nope. Hold on, just the wrong place. I probably have a few hundred places marked in here. I just have to find the right one. Oh yeah, okay, I found it. Okay. I'm not even sure we'll get to it right now. But what this is this is actually a section of the Baal HaSulam, the master of the ladder, Rabbi Yehuda Lev Ashlag's introduction to the study of the 10 Sfirot, okay? In paragraph actually 110 of that. So everybody's looking at me like I should have warned you in advance and you should have brought this book. No, sometimes it's better just to listen. Okay, yeah, okay. Rabbi Ashlag, may his memory be for a blessing. He actually is talking about the whole idea of the sayings of the sages on how a person's understanding of God's providence, the sins that you committed before can be transformed into inadvertent mistakes, and then another understanding of level of providence begins to transform those inadvertent mistakes into into meritorious acts even. It's very interesting. It all has to do with our understanding of God's providence. Just to remind you briefly from those 4 different phases of double concealment, single concealment, then the revelation of God's face from the fear of sin, and then the revelation of God's face from the love of God, okay, from the love of Hashem. All of those things have many levels also. When we come to the love of God, there's a conditional level, and then there's an unconditional level. And so this is what he has been talking about and explaining. And he begins paragraph 110 by saying, up to now we have only explained how a person comes to the first 2 levels of the conditional love of Hashem. He says, but we have yet to investigate how a person can come to relate to the Creator according to the 2 levels of unconditional love. In order to reach clarity on this issue, he says, we have to study a passage from the Talmud. The passage from the Talmud is going to be Kiddushin 40, that we just studied in the Maharal's understanding of Rabbi Akiva's. This is how it all ties in. It's going to be that same one. So it begins, Atana said, okay, and you know what Atana is. He's a 1st century or sage in that period of time, a Mishnaic sage. The Tana said, a man should always consider himself as if he is half liable, half guilty, and half meritorious, half worthy, okay? Remember, we just talked about this. If he does one mitzvah, then he should be very happy, for he has tilted the balance to the side of worthiness, to the side of merit. If he does one sin, woe to him that he tilted the balance to the side of liability. As the scripture says, and this is the entire quote of it from Ecclesiastes 9:18, one sinner can destroy much good. Just one, okay? Now he goes on. He is still talking about this and still in the Talmud. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, said, the world is judged according to the majority of its deeds. Again, now we see, by the way, Rabbi Akiva was the teacher of Rabbi Shimon, who was the father of Rabbi Elazar. So we see already where this teaching came from. It actually comes from Rabbi Akiva, okay? So Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, said the world is judged according to the majority of its deeds, and the individual is judged also according to the majority of his deeds. And if he does one mitzvah, then happy is he. Listen to what he says. Who tilted himself and the whole world to the side of merit. If he did one sin, woe to him who tilted the balance of himself and of all the world to the side of liability. As it is said, one sinner can destroy much good. quoting from Kohelet, from Ecclesiastes 9:18. Because of the one sin that the person did, Rabbi Elazar continues, because of that one sin that the person did, much good is lost to him and to all the world. What in the world is going on here? Now we've already seen one level of understanding that, the way the Maharal was explaining it on a very simple level. Rabbi Ashlag is fixing to take us down a different path here because this bothers him. This entire saying bothers him. He says, Rabbi Elazar's words seem to be riddled with difficulties from the beginning of them to the end. He says it's just one difficulty after another. What in the world is he talking about? He says that someone who does one mitzvah immediately tilts his or her balance to the side of merit because a person is judged according to the majority of their deeds. But surely, he says, this would only apply to an individual of whom it could be said that half of his deeds, exactly half of his deeds were good and half of his deeds were bad. So if I did one, then it moves it to the good side, okay? But Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, is not in fact talking about such a situation. He says the most important part of his words is in fact actually missing from our text. They're not in the text. But the commentator Rashi comes, and in his commentary to the Talmud, and explains the meaning. According to Rashi, he says Rav Elazar is referring to the statement of the Tana in the beginning, that a person should always consider himself or herself as being half liable. This is what you should think of yourself. Oh, I'm right in the middle. I'm half liable and I'm half meritorious, okay? But he adds that the person should also look at the whole world also. Looking at the entire world. The entire world is half meritorious, half liable. So Rav Ashlag says, if this is what he meant, then why didn't he say so? Why didn't he use the exact same language as the Tana did? Okay, so he has another question, even though Rashi comes and is attempting to clarify it. He says, the most difficult matter we need to consider here is how in the world can a person consider himself or herself as if he or she is only exactly half liable? Okay? He says, this is a mystery to me. If one knows for oneself that one has many, many sins, should he or she lie to himself or to herself and say that they are only chetzi v'chetzi, only half and half? The Torah tells us, he says in Exodus 23:7, keep your distance from a lie. He says that's lying to yourself. Furthermore, he says, if we take literally the statement that the one who commits a sin can lose much good, then this would imply that because of that one sin, the person tilts the balance for himself or for herself, together with the whole world, to the side of liability. He says, but we are not here to discuss, he says, we can bring up all of these questions and circumstances. He says, we're not here to discuss some hypothetical situation that a man or a woman might imagine. He says, the sages here are talking about reality as it is for ourselves and for the whole world. He goes on, Rabbi Elazar's words, he says, are even more puzzling when we consider the fact that in every generation there are many people who do at least one mitzvah. Yet the world is still not tilted to the side of merit. It seems the situation doesn't change at all, he says, but the world just carries on in the same old way. So we see that we need to understand, he says, what does he do? Does he say this text is a bunch of malarkey? He says, no. We have to understand this text on a much deeper level. There's something going on here. He said, because according to a superficial reading of it, we can't make any sense of it at all. This text is not talking about a man or a woman who knows for himself or herself that their sins are many. It is not trying to persuade the person to believe something false about themselves, namely that they are only half sinful or half meritorious, and thus to entice the person and persuade them that all they lack is just do one more mitzvah. He says that's not what it's talking about at all. That is not the way of the sages, he says at all. Rather, the Talmud is talking here about a person who feels or considers himself or herself to be a complete tzaddik. They've arrived. The person feels that he or she has achieved complete perfection. And this is because they have already become worthy of the first level of the love of God through the opening of their eyes in the Torah. They understand the Torah. through which, as we have learned, he says, God has already testified that when a person reaches that stage, that they will not return to their old ways. It is to such a person that the Tana is speaking, clarifying his or her path and proving to him or her that they are still not yet a tzaddik gamul, a complete tzaddik. They are still a benoni, an in-between person, okay? That is to say that a person is half liable and half meritorious. He or she is still not a complete tzaddik, and they still lack one mitzvah. This is why it mentions one mitzvah. They lack one mitzvah from all of the 613 mitzvot in the Torah, and guess what it is? The love of God. That's what they lack. The testimony of God that the person will no longer sin is only based on the clarity of his or her perception of the great loss that would be experienced. In other words, still what's in it for me, that would be experienced were they to commit a sin. That's called the fear of sin. For that reason, this state of consciousness of the person at this time is called transformation through the fear of sin. Maybe in 5 minutes we can get it. I'll try. No, there's no way. Absolutely no way. But we'll go as far as we can, and we'll finish it. We'll still finish this idea the next time we're together. Beseda? All right. Yofi. He says, we have already discussed about that this stage of transformation through the fear of sin, that actually only heals a person from the time of his or her transformation onwards. In other words, it heals you from that point of transformation and forward. But it doesn't heal your past life. It doesn't heal you retroactively. All of the pain and suffering that was undergone, he says, before meriting the revelation of God's face, and what he means by that is understanding God's providence, okay? Have stayed, he says, all of that pain and suffering have stayed exactly as they were without any healing at all. In other words, all of your messed up years, when you went through life in a state of double or single concealment, thinking that Hashem didn't care, that he wasn't involved, that he wasn't absolutely running everything, and that he wasn't doing it all for the good, okay? All of that hasn't been healed, is what he's saying. Also, the sins that you committed at that time, all those sins before that, they are not completely transformed, and they remain in their status of sins that were committed mistakenly, inadvertently. He says, and it is for this reason that the Tana is telling such a person who is still lacking that one mitzvah, that he or she should see himself as if they are half liable and half meritorious. That is to say, they should consider the moment when they merited transformation as the halfway point of their life. The half liable part is the time before that. The half meritorious is from then on. Do you see what he's saying? It's a totally different, higher level understanding of this. In this way, the liable half corresponds to that half of the person's life that they lived before reaching that transformation. This half is certainly liable, he says, as transformation from the fear of sin. It does not heal it. Yet they may also be considered as half meritorious, inasmuch as that second half of their life, even though it may be a small part of their life, okay, or maybe the larger part, doesn't matter. It's still hetzi v'chetzi. Inasmuch as the second half of their life, which transpires from the time of transformation and onwards, it is certainly meritorious because the person is sure not to go back to their old ways. Therefore, for the first half of one's life, one is liable. He said this is what it really means. For the first half of that life, you're liable. For the second half, it's meritorious. And until you come to the love of Hashem, do that one mitzvah, it remains that way. That's what the Tana is talking about on the highest level. We're not through. We need to re-examine this a little more, and I'll borrow a pencil for someone, and we'll mark some more in this book that I've marked all over the place in. And shalom uvracha, peace and a blessing. We'll get with it the very next time.
Thank you for joining us in our study. If you enjoyed this study and are interested in learning more from the Torah and the sages of Israel, then check us out on the internet at www.bfm101.com, or you may contact us toll-free at 1-800-639-0169. Our mailing address is Biblical Faith, P.O. Box 2, Abilene, Texas 79604. Until next time, we wish you shalom uvrakah, peace and a blessing.